Hello everyone, my name is Michael and I am the Director of Products at Apprenda. In this video I will demonstrate how to create and utilize a Bootstrap policy in Apprenda. You can think of this video also as a continuation of a previous video blog that we did on the integration between Apprenda and New Relic. In that particular video we talked about enhancing Apprenda applications to work with your standardized corporate-wide application performance monitoring tool, in this case New Relic, and we showed you how simple that is through the power of Apprenda extensibility and Bootstrap policies. The ability to add and extend the functionality of guest applications running on Apprenda through policy is one of the greatest and most powerful features that you have in our platform. Let's get started. What you're looking at here is our GitHub account for Apprenda. As you can see, we have an Apprenda New Relic integration section here that contains all of the files that are necessary to create the Bootstrap policy we're going to demonstrate today, including the source code to build the binaries yourself. In the README file, we actually have links to both the previous integration video on New Relic that I mentioned earlier, as well as 3 links that I'm going to show you here really quickly. The first one is some general documentation on Bootstrap policies for the Apprenda 5.5 release. The second link is a tutorial that helps you create a custom bootstrapper that works with Apprenda. And the third link is a blog post by our .NET lead that explains the power of bootstrapping and how you can leverage it to enhance your applications running on the Apprenda platform. In this specific section of our GitHub account, there's a zip file here, the apm bootstrapper.zip. This specific file here contains the files that Apprenda will need to create a custom Bootstrap policy through our operator portal, and I'm going to use that to upload that later on. Inside this file, it has a new relic.config file I'm going to show you in a second, including the binaries built out of the application monitoring bootstrapper.cs file. Let's take a look at this file first, and we can tackle the rest of the files in a second. In this file, once you go through the tutorial, you really understand the bootstrapper base that we're extending here and what the bootstrapping request class could provide to you as you're writing your code. In this specific section of the code, take notice that what we're really doing here is we're enumerating, anytime this bootstrap policy gets called, we're going to enumerate all the custom properties for the application. And we're looking for 2 very specific custom properties. We're looking for custom property called APM application name and another one called APM subscription ID. These are data that the developer will provide through custom properties to us, and our Bootstrap policy will be able to extract this data and leverage them as part of this code. So we're going to extract the application name as well as the subscription ID to the APM monitoring tool. And then what this Bootstrap policy will do is it will go and enumerate all the directories of the package that the developer provided. It will look for .config files, and as it finds those files, it's going to go ahead and modify the XML inside the config file to include the specific tags that New Relic requires for you in order for them to instrument your application. Now, your application can be one of 2 types. It's either IIS based, in which case we're modifying the web.config file, and we're adding things like the application pool for your application that you want New Relic to monitor, or it's a non-IIS based application, in which case we're editing the config file of the app and we're entering data in there like the application name that you want New Relic to use when it's instrumenting your code and the fact that it's agent enabled. In addition to that, for applications that are non-IIS based, we're also dropping a New Relic.config file in there that contains things like the license key that you want to use for your application, as well as a couple of other details like your IIS application name, which is basically your application pool that we talked about earlier. Now, the fact that we're providing a New Relic.config file with each application allows us to control the subscription and the flow of data from this application to the New Relic subscription that you have in the cloud. So essentially, by having a different New Relic config file for each application, you can control where the data goes to each subscription and who has access to view that. And I'm going to show you later on how that's super important to us. As we're navigating further down the code, this is the location where we're basically editing the XML document, and we're using regular XML document manipulation here to insert inside the app settings of the document both the New Relic app name and whether it's agent enabled. The agent enablement is only applicable to non-IIS based applications. For the IIS based ones, that's not a necessary part. And you'll see here that we're making a check to see, check the component type of the application that you're deploying and make sure it's either a WCF service or a Windows service in order for you to add the agent enable key. And the last but not least, here's the XML document manipulations here to insert the different elements inside the node app settings, which is exactly where New Relic is expecting to find it. Let's go back here and let's take a look at the New Relic.config file. Now this is a file that we're including as part of the bootstrapping policy. It's kind of a templatized file that we want to manipulate during the creation of the bootstrap policy. Like I showed you earlier, one of the things that we do, we're going ahead and replacing the license key, and we're also replacing the IIS application name with the proper values for the deployment we're making. Other than that, this is a standard New Relic file that has abstracted those two key elements that will allow us to control the flow of data as well as which application we're instrumenting at this point in time. Now that I've showed you kind of the bare bones of this specific bootstrap policy, you have both the code, you have the zip file, as well as a little bit of documentation on the New Relic.config file, and you can go ahead and create this bootstrap policy yourselves. Let's go ahead and open up the zip file here for a second. So I'm opening up the Git application on my Windows desktop, and I want to open in Explorer here the repo that I have here. You see the same files that I showed you on the web. Let's go ahead and open up the APM bootstrapper.zip file. You see you have a couple of different things here. You have the API.extension.dll from Apprenda that is a necessary component anytime you're creating a bootstrap policy. I've included the APM bootstrapper.dll, which is a DLL I created by compiling my C# code that I showed you earlier, as well as the New Relic.config, which is basically nothing but the templatized version of the New Relic config that I also showed you earlier. Now that we have all this, let's go ahead and create a bootstrap policy in Apprenda. What you're looking here is the application bootstrap policy section of the operator portal. Let's click on new bootstrap policy. I'm going to call it the New Relic APM bootstrap policy. We want it to be applicable to .NET application components that apply both to the sandbox, which is our dev and test stage, as well as the publish stage of our applications. Now you have a couple of options when you're creating a bootstrap policy. You can either select the option where you're going to specify libraries to load into deployments. Essentially what you're telling Apprenda here is go to this library path and copy all the data defined in this library path into each deployment. The library path could contain license files, it could contain DLLs that are necessary for a specific application to run, or anything else. It's completely up to you to dictate what files you want to include in this library path, and they will all be copied into your applications as they get deployed in the Apprenda platform. The second option is to run a custom workflow for deployments, and this is exactly where things are starting to get interesting, because this is where we're going to be able to utilize this DLL, the bootstrapper DLL that we just created, that contains code that will be executed on every deployment of the application that meets certain criteria. And we're going to show you the criteria on the next page. So let's go ahead and select our file here. And let's see what the conditions are under which every time you want the Bootstrap policy to be run. You can choose to always Bootstrap or deploy components, or you can choose to only Bootstrap if the component being deployed satisfies a certain logic. In this case, I wanted to satisfy the logic where the applications that you're deploying have the application performance monitoring group set to enabled. And I'm going to show you what the APM performance monitoring group is in a second. But essentially what I'm doing here is I created a custom property group in Apprenda that my developers are going to get to see and utilize, and through the custom policy, custom property group, they get to dictate whether they want APM monitoring or not within their applications. We're going to navigate to the custom properties so I can show you the two custom properties I showed you earlier in the code that we're looking for when we're running a Bootstrap policy, as well as a custom property group that becomes and encapsulates those two custom properties and creates a grouping that you can enable or disable. So the first custom properties, you see it here, is the APM application name. Let's go ahead and edit it here so I can show you what that is. It allows custom value, meaning the developer gets to not only is visible to him the custom property, but it's also required for deployment, and he can also edit it to enter his own custom name. The second one is the APM subscription ID, and this is nothing but the subscription ID to a New Relic environment that you have. It's kind of their license key. Again, we want the developer to enter a custom value, and it's required for deployment, and it's also editable by them. The third thing here, and this is what we actually wrapped our Bootstrap policy around, is this application performance monitoring group. It also applies to applications, and in this specific case, this group contains only two properties, the two properties I showed you earlier that are of value to us. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you how a developer gets to utilize this and be able to create a new application and dictate whether he wants APM monitoring or not. So let's switch hats here. Right now, we're looking at the operator portal as an operator of the IT infrastructure for Apprenda. Let's go ahead and switch sides here, and we're looking at the developer portal, where now I'm wearing the developer hat. And I want to create a new application that wants to leverage New Relic to be able to do my APM monitoring. Let's go ahead and call our application here timecard New Relic. I'm going to select here the package file for my application. I'll go to my download section here. And I'm going to pick up an archive file, and I'm going to say save and continue. Now you may ask, what does that archive file contains? And I'm going to show you here in a second. So this is a location where we'll open our archive file. Let's go ahead and open timecard New Relic archive. This is basically, an archive is just a zip file that contains a well-defined structure of all the elements that basically comprise your application. You have your interfaces, and in this case I have one website which is called root. You have your persistence, which is basically your database scripts that tell Apprenda how to create our database as service, how to provision your database, what the schema of the database is, and so on and so forth. And then you have your services, which in this case are your WCF services that you have that are part of your application. The last but not least part of this manifest is the deployment manifest that basically is explaining the different settings and properties that you want to make available to Apprenda as part of this application. Let's go ahead and close this. Our application was done in terms of uploading the archive and creating a model of your application within Apprenda. Now we're on the configure part of our application, and let's go ahead and under the deployment section. You're going to notice here this application performance monitoring group. This is a group that the operator created, and he said it's available to developers. It's required for deployment. They need to actually go ahead and edit this and provide some values. In this case, I want to mark it as enabled, meaning I want this application to have APM monitor. In this case, I get a couple of options. I can specify my APM application name. This is the name that will show up in the New Relic portal when I'm monitoring my application. And I'm going to call it tcard New Relic. The second part of this is the APM subscription ID. And like I mentioned earlier, this is really the license key for New Relic. And I'm going to show you where I got this value in a little bit. Let's go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go to the Scale tab. And I'm going to instruct Apprenda to make sure that we have at least a minimum instance of 1 for both my WCF service as well as my website. Now Apprenda will enforce a minimum of 1 instance across the board for my application. Now we're ready to promote it. Now my application is in the definition stage where we get to configure most of its settings. Once we promote it, it can go to our sandbox stage, which is our dev and test stage, where the application is made available to us. You will notice that at the end, when we actually enter the sandbox mode, you're not getting anything more than a website URL where you get to manage your app. You don't get virtual machines, you don't get IP addresses or VLANs or any of the other things that are complex and they're necessary when you're running your applications in virtual machines. In this case, all we get back is a URL. While that's happening, let me show you a couple of different things here within the New Relic portal. What you're viewing here is a subscription to the New Relic portal that contains all of the different applications that are basically necessary to create the Apprenda platform. So we actually went ahead and monitor our entire Apprenda platform here, and you see applications like the load manager, the account portal, storage, zookeeper, presentation layer. We have the SOC here, which is the operator portal I was using earlier, monitoring, Windows container. So you see like a slew of applications here that we are monitoring in this subscription from Apprenda. If I wanted to see the license key for this, I can go up on the top here and go into account settings, and I get to see the licensing key for this specific New Relic portal. That's not the licensing key that I used though when I created my application earlier. Each development team that you grant access to be able to use your New Relic subscription can have its own license key and its own username and password to be able to log in to the New Relic portal. So in a way, you can sandbox the amount of data the individual users can view to be just the data for their own applications that the development team owns. In this case, I went ahead and created a secondary subscription. I'm going to switch accounts here to the Apprenda 2 subscription, which, as you're seeing here, has no data here. It has no monitored applications. I'm going to go to the account settings page, and as you can see, we do have the licensing key that I copied earlier as part of the custom properties when I was creating my brand new application. Each development team now can have its own subscription key, its own New Relic subscription. It can have data that rolls up and is only made available to the persons that should be able to have access to that data. Now, as you can imagine, an extension of this capability is to create an add-on in Apprenda where the operator allows individual development teams to create an instance of a subscription into New Relic. So you can use the REST API and the API of New Relic to programmatically enforce the creation of a new license key and a new subscription into New Relic, and you can make that available to your developers. So now through Apprenda add-ons and Bootstrap policies, developers can request a subscription into New Relic. They can utilize that as part of creating their applications, and then they can basically, once they create that instantiation of the add-on, all they're getting back is a license key, a username, and a password. And they can use those 3 data to be able to log into the New Relic portal, be able to only view and manage their applications, and all that process is managed by Apprenda. So you can see how policy can enforce access into external resources outside of Apprenda and still be able to give IT the control they need in terms of who should have access and how much access into those resources. Let's go ahead and go back to our dashboard here. Our application should be getting ready to be promoted now. So what's happening behind the scenes here is Apprenda basically has a model of your application, all the different parts that we talked about earlier, like your WCF services, as well as your websites, and it's going to find ideal hosts for each one of those different components in the Apprenda grid. And once we find the ideal host, we're going to go and deploy those components within the services basically and processes within the system. The websites are going to go into IIS, and the WCF services are going to be hosted within the Apprenda container. And then once we're done, we'll interconnect all these components and return back and tell you that your application is in sandbox mode. Now I mentioned the grid infrastructure earlier. Essentially what the grid infrastructure of Apprenda is a collection of compute nodes that we use to be able to allow you to have the application runtime environment that we provide to both the .NET as well as Java applications. Okay, our application is now successfully promoted. Once it's refreshed here, we're going to see a link here to launch it. So let's go ahead and launch our application here. So what's happening now is, we're going to this URL, apps.apprenda.victoria timecard new relic --v1. That's an indication of the version of the application that we are in, and that's because we're in the sandbox mode and we're not running in production. Now while this is happening now, it's going to launch our application, it's going to go instantiate the different instances of that and pop up the UI. Let's go ahead and add an employee here. I'm going to add myself here. And while we're saving this, I'm going to go into the operator portal and I'm going to go look for this application so I can actually see on which service it's running on. That way I can show you guys the end result of the new relic.config file and some of the changes we made into the individual application config files. So we'll call it timecard new relic here. It's this one, it's in version 1. Here what we'll see is the deployed instances of the components of this timecard instance of New Relic that we created. We're going to see that we have at least one component in our UI and at least one component of our WCF service. We notice here that they're running on server Victoria 01. Let's go ahead and go on that server so I can show you the changes that were impacted as part of the Bootstrap policy that was run. Let's go to Victoria 01 server. Let's go ahead and open up the Apprenda folder here. It's under Apprenda platform. The websites are going to go under the site data. I'll open up Notepad here so we can put the file here. And we'll have this timecard new relic version 1 instantiation of our app. And under the root folder that's for IIS component, we have the web.config file. Let's go ahead and open that. And you notice here there's a significant and very important change here, which is under app settings, we added the new relic.app name, which is tcard and relic, which is what I chose earlier as the name of my application in New Relic. In addition to this change into the app settings that the Bootstrap policy created, it also dropped a new relic.config file that has a couple of key information. One of it is the license key for the subscription that I'm using, as well as the application pool name for this instantiation of my website. These changes is what enables New Relic to start instrumenting this IIS web application and pushing the data into their servers. Let's take a look at the second workload we have here, and that's the WCF service. Now that's process 6016. If you're familiar with Apprenda, you know that all the WCF services are running under the Apprenda container, and that's running under the WCF service host.exe. 6016 was the process ID for our application, so we can open the file location here, and that takes us directly to the folder of the timecard service. I'm going to order this so I can actually see the config files here that we changed, And again, I see the New Relic.config file that I can bring here, and it has the same similar data that we saw earlier for the web app. It has a license key, doesn't have an application pool name, but it still has a WCF service host.exe, which is basically telling New Relic, go ahead and instrument all the WCF service host.exes, put them under this license key subscription, and the most important thing for this here, if we open up the DLL config file for our timecast service, it also entered the values under app settings, instructing New Relic to create the application name called tcard and relic. So it consolidates the data of our WCF service with our web app, and it's telling it that, because it is a WCF service and it's not IIS based, you want to enable the New Relic agent. There's important changes into the config files, both by dropping the New Relic.config as well as making editing to the application configuration files, are the necessary drivers to enable the instrumentation of the code of this application so it can send the APM monitoring data back into New Relic. Now that we've seen that, let's go back to the New Relic portal and see if we start getting any data here. Let's go to our applications. And remember, this subscription was blank earlier, and now we have the tcard and relic, which was the application name that we gave it as part of the custom properties. And if we open that up, we'll start seeing data flowing from both our WCF service as well as our website. And it has data about the WCF transactions we have, any database calls that we make. You get usage data and browser analytics, as well as deep insight into how your application is being used. Now, imagine here the power of extensibility of the Bootstrap policies, the simplicity of them, how easy it is to enforce policy and to create policy such that applications that want APM monitoring, they can just by selecting a couple of checkboxes and adding a couple of values be able to drive programmatically the creation of the APM monitoring tags into their applications so New Relic immediately can start getting data. Now developers as well as operators can enhance the experience of their application while at the same time getting all these advanced data and metrics from New Relic that will help them understand their data better, understand the experience that customers are getting, as well as being able to deliver significant innovation and value to their end customers. Thank you so much.